So I have the honor um, to announce that Terence Lee will do the keynote, and he's not only a contributor on the token of the Eureka, but as well helped out in organizing Raid Scots, which I appreciate a lot. And so please give him a warm welcome. We're very happy that he's here. Thank you.
Moin moin. I think that's what I'm supposed to say, right? And I think I'm wearing the towel properly. I got told the proper etiquette by Jan before getting on stage so I could partake in this. Um, as well being the coolest keynote, I think I am the least cool keynote because I'm the only one, so you're kind of stuck with what I'm going to tell you. So I'm Terence. I go by Hone02 on Twitter. I'm mostly known in the Ruby community for wearing a blue hat all the time, so that's how people generally identify me in crowds. I come all the way from Austin, Texas, but luckily I was already in Europe, so I'm not super jet lagged this weekend. We're known in the US for having really amazing tacos as well as barbecue, but if you're ever in town in Austin, you can definitely hit me up and I'd be happy to take you out for tacos. I work at a platform and services company called Heroku. That is great for deploying Ruby apps as well as many other things. And so enough about kind of my intro stuff. So I was kind of approached, I think, last year to come talk this year at Ruby Unconf by Jan, who I haven't even seen here this whole time, so I don't know where he is. But I was having dinner with some of the organizers last night, and I think learning that Aaron was the keynote from last year made me even super nervous about giving this keynote because those are like pretty big shoes to fill. But then at the dinner, I was then told that he sang a song in German, which learning late last night that was kind of the bar. I did not have time to really prepare any German singing songs. But then I also learned that no one actually knew the song that he sang. So then I felt a little better about that. And so this was kind of the announcement, I guess, like earlier this month. So there was not a lot of notice ahead of time. But I think the only response to this tweet was this one about how I give really good technical talks. And then Ruby Karaoke, of course. And even on my name badge, I think they automatically just wrote the hashtag Ruby Karaoke. So there's that. And so unfortunately, this is not going to be a hardcore technical talk. I feel like those just tend not to be very good ways to kick off conferences for me personally. So I want to give a little bit of a different talk. So I'm curious, in the room, how many people have been here in the Ruby community for 10 years and was there before Bundler was a thing? Well, it's 10%, 20%. It's pretty good. So I want to tell a story, and this is kind of a personal story for me because it's a little bit about my journey through open source development and other things. And as I was preparing for this talk, I learned that Bundler is about a decade old. So that kind of dates how old I feel being in this community. And so to kind of kick it off, I got my first full-time programming job in the spring of 2009 for a small startup in Austin, Texas called Other Inbox. And when you start your full job, when you first stay in your job, you get a computer and you have to set it up. And we weren't even using Git because that was just starting to become the cool thing. GitHub was not around then. I remember checking out the source code Insta version, and we were on the latest, greatest Rails 2.3 release, and this is how you basically did dependency management in the dark days of Rails 2. They had, so instead of the gem file, you had these config.gem lines where you kind of put the gems that you need to install, and then basically you would, when you cloned it, you could then run this rake gems install command, and it would go and actually through that list and actually install them into your system gems in Ruby. But there was always a few gems that just didn't quite work right. So even after you ran this, you still couldn't get that Rails app to run. And so you had to go through and figure out the gems that didn't work. And Cucumber was always one of those gems that never worked properly through this process. So you had to manually install it. But of course, if you just run this command, it gives you the latest one, and definitely like pre-1.0 Cucumber, they were not backwards compatible with each other. So you had to go and ask your coworker for the exact version of Cucumber that they were running on their machine, so you can install that version so you could get the actual test to pass. And so there's a set of gems, usually the ones with like bins that came with the gems that you had to run, that you kind of had to manually do. And after going through enough of these, you eventually got like a working system. And so some of the stuff that Rails kind of incorporated was this gems unpack thing, which allowed you to kind of go through that list, and it would unpack all the gems into a vendor folder that you can then check into your repository. So then anyone who cloned could have the exact same versions of those gems. But of course, you could only do it for pure Ruby gems because it didn't do like native compilation for any of the extensions. So there was like, it only worked some of the times. And then you could, of course, just do like specific ones because not all of them worked. But it took about like a whole day to kind of get a working environment, which I think is a stark contrast how most people start today on their computers with Bundler. So we take a lot for granted for how hard it used to be. And so a whole full working 8 hours is what it took to get me to run tests for the first time on my machine on the first day of my job. And then hopefully, like, there was a README that kind of described all the stuff that I just talked about of like the specific things that I had to set up and install. And so there's this kind of this whole thing of like a lot of work just to maintain and like have the kind of consistent developer like gems and stuff across all the machines people were working with, and then forget running stuff in production, which was a whole nother problem. So the second kind of thing I wanted to talk about was gem activation errors from that time. So I'm going to fast forward to a different point. So I was working for kind of the same company. They had like a consulting arm, and I basically went and like moved our app off of AWS onto Heroku, and that's kind of how I first got exposed to all this stuff. And to kind of go through and like install dependencies on the Heroku Bamboo stack, which I don't know how many of you were around for that, there was this gems manifest file that was just this .gems file that you put into your repository, and then you just listed like version constraints, the name of the gem, and kind of where the gem came from. It wasn't from Ruby gems. And all it would do would go through and install like the gems in order and kind of all the dependencies that you had one by one, which sounds like pretty standard, pretty simple, like, you know, what actually could go wrong here. And so on March 23rd in 2010, Rails 2.3.6 came out, and this was a very infamous release of Rails for me. And the reason is there was standard stuff in the patch release, but one of the changes was actually this one. So in Action Pack, they decided to upgrade the dependency of rack from 1.01 to 1.10, which if you've ever had gem activation errors, you can definitely predict like what's about to happen next. So you would get an error message like this basically after that was released, and I think if you kind of Google for this, you'll be able to find some of this stuff, but it would tell you to basically do this thing to like set this constant or install this version of Rails, but it didn't actually fix your problem, which sucked. And the reason why it was a problem was because of basically how RubyGems handles activations. So RubyGems allows you to have multiple versions of gems installed on your system, and by default, it will actually reference stuff that's installed on the system first, kind of in like the latest order. And so depending on the order that your gems activate, you can imagine like a dependency that had a dependency on some version of Action Pack that eventually led to like this rack dependency for some library you had. And if it activated like 1.01, but then you activated your version of Rails that depended on 1.10 later, it would break. And potentially that dependency also allowed you to also have rack 1.10 as a dependency, but since it was activated first, like you got the other rack thing activated already. And so when you booted up your app, it would just break. And you would not be able to have it work. And so what you would have to do is you'd literally have to manually go through your dependency graph and figure out which dependency to tell the system to ignore the dependencies that it need to install. So eventually you could actually boot your application. So if we kind of go back in time from 2010, this is well, at least at the time, this was our local Austin Ruby conference. And so this was actually a really pivotal conference for me because this was the first time that I met Carl and Yehuda. They were actually giving just a lightning talk, so a 5-minute talk about this new project called Bundler that I'd never heard of before, and I think they literally just started it like probably months before coming and talking about it. And to kind of understand like why this project was created, I think we have to go back and talk a little bit about MERB. So for those of you who aren't familiar with MERB, it was a kind of competing framework at the time, web framework to Rails, and this was like when Rails 2 was around. And there was a bunch of things that were different and things that basically we kind of take advantage of know today. But the most important one for this particular talk was that MERB was a very modular framework, which compared to the Rails 2 time, Rails was a pretty monolithic framework. And what I mean by that is like if you pulled in the MERB gem, it actually had like I think somewhere between like 8 to 10 other gems as dependencies, which doesn't sound that crazy in this day and age. And the reason that is because in 2008 they announced that the next version of MERB would actually be Rails 3, and that Rails and MERB were going to join forces and basically work together to basically take the best things from MERB and combine them with Rails. So Rails 3 actually went from this kind of monolithic framework to one that was going to be more modular, that had an extensible API. Like one of the problems with Rails 2 was that there was no public API, so the plugins you would write would be coded against internal APIs. So at any point, if they updated it, like your Rails plugins would just break with no notice, really, which you can imagine how fantastic that is. But so in order to kind of handle this kind of dependency growth, they needed a way to kind of manage all these dependencies. So that's kind of where Bundler was born. And so my first foray into Bundler after this lightning talk was Bundler 0.8, and it had this concept of the gem file. And so the gem file hasn't changed all too much, actually, besides a few commands and things as part of the DSL in there. But it's what you think it is. You have gem, then the name, and potentially the version. And then what Bundler 0.8 would do is instead of activating each gem one by one, it would actually look at all the dependencies and then try to resolve in memory a way to actually boot your application so it can take everything into account. And that was kind of one of the big differentiators between how Bundler worked and how basically you just did that with Ruby gems. In the Bundler 0.9 release cycle, it's when we actually got introduced to the gemfile.lock. And so kind of the big thing here was that, oh, maybe we should write that thing in memory to disk so we can persist it and have that work. But it actually went through a ton of iterations, and so the kind of developer experience around Bundler 0.9, if you're around for that, was pretty awful. You would have to bundle lock to get the gemfile.lock. You'd have to then bundle install because you had it, and if you ever wanted to make changes to the lock file, you had to unlock it to then relock it again and then install it. It was pretty, like subpar to what we know. And so when Bundler 1 came out, we actually, they made the change to remove the unlock command, and actually most people now, like the bundle lock command still exists, so you can use it to generate the gemfile.lock, but you don't have to do that first. If you just want to install stuff, you can just run bundle install. So most people actually just do bundle install and probably don't even know the bundle lock command exists. So that's great. We made it to 1.0, and people are using it, but it wasn't a smooth ride at all. It was actually a pretty rocky road. And so people who went along to the Bundler, so these are all the 0.9 releases. There's like a bunch of them. And so this went from like the end of January all the way to like the beginning of June. So like 5 months of time. And we had, 26 releases plus another like 5, 6 pre-releases. So a lot of releases in such a short span. And unfortunately, like most of these releases weren't backwards compatible. So you actually so at the time I was like consulting for a client that I stupidly moved over to Bundler, and every time Heroku decided to update Bundler, I had to stop everything I was doing to then upgrade Bundler locally to match the version that I was using so I could then deploy again. And it would take hours. And so my client was not super happy with that decision that I made. So that was a problem. So people were kind of jaded from this whole 0.9 thing before 1.0 came out, to kind of set context. I think, and then the gemfile.lock thing was a whole new concept. Like this was not a thing that existed before in any ecosystem, and people just didn't know why you needed this file. Like, why does it exist? And you don't have to read this thing, but it was such a common question that on the bundler homepage, this was like on the homepage to tell people why you need this thing, because it was like the most asked question. And even with all this stuff, people were looking for ways. Why do I have this bundler thing? Why do I have to use it for Rails 3? Because it was mandatory when Rails 3 came out. And so people were looking for ways like, oh, if I delete the gem file and the log file and then remove all the requires, but I manually gem install this stuff, I can still boot my Rails app, right? And so then people had, there was this gem called isolate, which allowed people to kind of sandbox things into a temp directory of all the gems that would be installed. And then if you use RVM, you're probably familiar with the gem sets command, but allowed you to basically create like private sandbox gems that RVM would handle, so you could create like a gem set per application to kind of keep them by themselves. They didn't solve like all the problems Bundler did, but people were definitely looking for ways out of it. And then if you just searched at the time, like you would be able to find tons of things that of how to not use Bundler, basically. And so in October 9th of 2010, because I did a bunch of work on the Heroku side to like get Bundler 1.0 working on our platform with relatively little fanfare and problems, they added me. I don't know if this was a troll or not, but they added me as a committer, like gave me commit bit to this project. And at this point, I've never like cloned the project or looked at it or kind of did anything with it, but I now had like write access to this really important project. And this is kind of my real first open source project. So just like for context, right? Like so October 9th. So the first release I helped with was like 1.03, and then if you look at all these other releases that I helped with, I basically had to yank the next 3 releases and then release something afterwards to fix the problems that introduced in the previous release. So don't like cut your teeth on a major infrastructure project as your first open source project. So I'm like, this didn't help, right? And then I assume you've seen stuff and have had this problem of like, why do I have to have bundle exec? Like this is really annoying. Like people would alias this to BE to just like have fewer characters of the type, or there's like a bunch of blog posts about how you can use like bins, like the bundler bin stubs, and set them to your path so you don't have to type bundle exec and it loads the proper environment. And so this has always been like a historic problem with bundler since 1.0. The other big one was probably like this XKT comment where they basically changed out compiling and put in bundler as Rubyist. And so bundler 1.0 was actually really slow. So like it would take 30 seconds to install. If you had a gem file with 1 gem in it with no dependencies, it still took like 30 seconds to just run bundle install. And the reason was because the way bundler 1.0 worked was that Ruby gems had this basically specs index that contained all the gems of all the versions of all the platforms, and bundler had to load that entire object graph into memory. And then with that object graph, it could then resolve and determine the actual dependencies. And in this case, it would be like 1 gem for this one version to satisfy that thing. So as you know, like object creation in Ruby is not necessarily super fast. And so one of my main contributions as being part of the core team in my tenure there was working on this 1.1 release, where I actually worked to basically have this dependency thing that would actually hit the RubyGems API, where there was a new dependency API, and it would fetch a much smaller subset of the things that you needed, so the amount of objects that were created. And since then, we've had 16 releases on the project that have done stuff like HTTP pipelining, persistence, parallel job execution, things like that, to make the bundler that we know today a much better and smoother experience. It's kind of funny looking back, like bundler basically won, right? Like I actually had a really hard time preparing the first half of this first part of this presentation, because I had to go into the Wayback Time Machine to pull some of like this information out, because this material just doesn't exist, because like people don't talk about it anymore, right? Like it is really hard to find this on Stack Overflow. You just really can't. And in December of this last December for Ruby 2.6, like bundler 1.17 got merged as part of standard lib. It's a default gem that's like shipped with Ruby. So basically from now until, I guess unless they secretly remove it sometime, like every version of Ruby is gonna have bundler in it. So you don't even have to gem install bundler. It's there. Bundler has made it. It's a part of the ecosystem, and I think you're hard pressed to find someone who doesn't use bundler who's a Rubyist today in any project that they work on. But that's kind of like my story and kind of how I got involved. And you know, I didn't really just come here to talk about myself because that's not particularly interesting, as fun as that story is with some of the jokes and things. But what is actually important here is that I think this is a story that is actually a story from the Ruby community that's about people in the Ruby community, because Bundler is a project that came from Ruby. And so there's a lot of lessons that I think we can, if we go and look through the different things from the story that I said, that we can actually learn from. And one of the first things is that I think it's super common in the world, but also in programming especially, to kind of like put these people who are the creators of these projects, like Carl and Yehuda, on these pedestals, these heroes. And though they put in a ton of work and put in a ton of time and energy to make Bundler happen, what really happened in practice was that they were leaders, and they provided a lot of leadership on the project in addition to the work. But like almost every other open source project, they can't do it by themselves. There's a whole team of contributors, whether they're contributors who are contributing to it constantly or people who are applying one-off patches. There's a whole wealth of people that made Bundler the success it is today that we know and love, right? And part of that, for better or worse, is they place trust in the people that they work with, right? So I did those releases, but part of that was like a learning practice too, right? Like, so I definitely started releasing less terrible versions of Bundler after kind of that short stint. And what was important is that you need to be able to rally people behind your cause. And when you look back today, it doesn't seem like lock files and things are controversial, but at that time, like, there was no other system that had a lock file. So it was actually this highly controversial thing. Like, we had that thing on that homepage because people didn't understand why we needed that. And if you're doing something that's controversial, most people you talk to are going to be skeptical. Even people that you respect in the community that are super smart and have done great things, like, you have to convince them that what you're doing is worthwhile or worth looking at. And when you're doing something controversial, you can't predict what the outcome's going to be, right? And so when Carl and Yehuda set out to do Bundler, like, the reason I told you about the MERB thing was it was meant to solve that problem. They did it to solve the dependency management problem in Rails 3 and hopefully like the broader Ruby community. But they probably had no idea that the thing that they end up creating would change how people do dependency management across every ecosystem in the industry, right? And so this thing that came out of the Ruby community has percolated into all these other ecosystems, right? So like in Elixir, there's one, Rust, Node, PHP, Go, Python. Like, basically every major language that you can think of has a lock file, and sometimes multiple versions of them. And maybe they didn't start there, but they've eventually gotten there, right? So like, even with Go, like Go mod, this Go package.lock is like now part of the Go project. And for the longest time, they were like very anti, like, we're just not going to build dependency manager as part of a system. And a lot of that success is due to lock files being successful in Ruby. And I think if that didn't happen, this probably would not have happened either. And so I think the Bundler story is great, but what I think and I find inspiring is that the Bundler story is not actually unique in the Ruby community. And so if you don't know who Chris Epstein is, he's the creator of SAS. And I think one of the things that's super cool about this story, this is the tweet that actually kind of got me thinking about this whole talk and everything. And he found that, like, basically SAS, well, it's not SAS, but CSS was kind of the ugliest part of his beautiful Ruby application. And he identified this gap and he wanted to close it. He wanted to find a way to make that better. And so he created this SAS project that came out of the Ruby and Rails community. And what's actually cool, like, so it's kind of sad that Ruby SAS is dying and it's on its way out, it's not being maintained. But what's kind of really amazing about it is this thing that came out of the Ruby community has outgrown Ruby, right? Like, so many people outside of Ruby are using this project to do stuff with CSS. Like, and CSS has been around for a long time, right? Like, when SAS came around, CSS is like old technology, right? So many people could have done this thing, but the Ruby community was the first community that did it and kind of changed how this stuff worked. And I think that's really amazing. And what's more amazing is that these two stories aren't like the only two stories. There's so many stories in the Ruby community that I think are like the ones that I've just talked about, right? So we have stuff all the way from the technical side, like definitely like back a few years ago, like the whole testing craze, right? Like it seemed like every few months there was yet a new testing framework. There was like Bacon, mini tests, RSpec, Cucumber, a bunch of other things that I don't even remember now because there were so many. But like our testing culture is super strong, and if you look at other communities, you see that like so many of those communities borrow things that were basically created in the Ruby community, right? As far as testing. I think if you start to kind of shift to some of the non-technical things, there's also just as many equally awesome things that have come out of this ecosystem, right? So like Coreline's Code Covenant, I think is a great example. Like it's being used in the Linux kernel as the code of conduct there. Like if that's not like one of the most important open source projects that's been around for a long time and large and kind of started this whole movement, I don't know what is. Like that's a huge sign of success and progress. I think with like Rails Bridge and Rails Girls, like we've done such a good job of trying to help people enter and be part of this community. I've been lucky to kind of had a front row seat in a lot of stuff with Rails Girls, but I think what has made those projects successful has been they've been able to document the process of what it takes to actually run one of these events and kind of start one of these projects and be open and encourage other ecosystems to also do the same thing, right? It's like not our own thing, it's a thing that other people should also do because we believe in it. And so you have projects like GoBridge and Closure Bridge, Django Girls that have come out of this thing, and we're happy to embrace all these communities and help them kind of be successful, which I think is fantastic. And kind of the last thing I want to touch on this slide is kind of the code schools and boot camps. For those of you who don't know, like that came out of the Ruby community, and actually Hungry Academy was the first one of these, and it came out of Living Social. And so in March of 2012, they started this thing, which at the like if we similar to like the bundler thing, like seems common, that doesn't seem that special, but like there was no other boot camp that existed. Boot camp was not a word that like was associated with programming, right? And they were having a hard time hiring engineers. And so what they did was they wanted to train people who didn't have technical backgrounds, who didn't come from school doing CS, to basically train them to be a programmer. And so many people doubted that you could do this, like take these people, have them in this program, and then basically have them be junior developers that could actually work in the field in the span of a few months, right? But of course, we know the end of that story, right? Like, there's so many of these, it's like hard-pressed to go to a conference where you don't meet at least one person who's been to a boot camp. And all the people I've met that have done this are amazing developers, right? Like, they bring a diverse set of interests and backgrounds that I don't have, that come from different ecosystems. And it's really great that this exists. And the funny thing is, like, a lot of the boot camps that I interact with in the US, like, a lot of them don't even teach Ruby anymore, right? Like, a lot of them do Node and other things. But this is a thing that originated in the Ruby community because we saw a problem that we needed to solve, and we didn't care what anyone else told us if we could do it or not. So I would like to kind of close and talk about, I think what makes this community such a special place is that we have this long history, which that list was just stuff that I thought of, which there's plenty of other stuff I think that could be added to that list that I don't even know about, right? But we're a community of people that innovate and don't accept the status quo of what is out there, and we're willing to kind of push that boundary. And for kind of the last story that I want to tell as part of this talk, you had this great quote, and it says, "Let your ambitions, not your existing skills, be your guide." And so kind of some other tweets that he had related to this that I think were threaded that I didn't include was that when he started the Bundler project, he actually had no idea how to write a dependency resolver. He didn't know how to write a dependency manager. He had to look up how to do a SAT solver, and he had to go and learn those things. And there's many people who doubted him, on this journey. I covered like all these things as part of the Rocky Road. I mean, probably for the first 4 or 5 years of Bundler's life, like it was not well respected and treated in the Ruby community, which is totally different from where it is today. But he didn't let any of those people tell him what was possible, and he went and did it. along with all the other people who helped him. And as part of that, he also made a lot of other people believe, right? We all use Bundler today, so we're all believers of the stuff that he's worked on. I believed in it because I went and spent 4 years working on Bundler. And so he was able to inspire kind of the next generation of people to continue working on it. Since me, like Andre has been around almost since the beginning and has also now trained and mentored other people to work on it. And for 10 years, this has been a well-maintained ecosystem community project. So as a closing, I would like to ask everyone here, as part of the Ruby community, to challenge yourself. Don't let yourself be the person that's going to impede your ability to do things, as well as don't let someone be able to tell you that you can't do something, because I think we have a history to show that we can. And we won't know where that comes, and I think we owe it to ourselves to also inspire our friends and family, as well as the next generation of people that are going to be joining our community. Thank you.